They say the coldest contracts are signed with the warmest smiles. In Julian Crane's world, everything was a transaction, measurable, negotiable, contained. So when his board of directors insisted that his bachelor status was casting shadows over an imminent merger with a conservative European family conglomerate, Julian did what he always did. He found a solution. But this time, it wore red sneakers and didn't blink once during the offer. Celine Varelli wasn't supposed to be the answer. She wasn't vetted through matchmaking firms or curated through elite connections. She simply appeared, recommended by someone Julian trusted just enough to not ask questions. Her resume was clean, her demeanor quiet, and when she stepped into his office with a calm that bordered on unnerving, Julian's finely tuned instincts faltered. He made the offer anyway, a one-year contract marriage, public appearances, photos, signature events, a clean split after the merger, no intimacy, no entanglements. Celine read every line in silence, her thumb grazing the edge of the paper like she was remembering something rather than reading it. Then she looked up at him, her eyes the color of a thunderstorm, too far to hear, but too close to ignore. "I accept," she said. No questions, no hesitation. Just that voice, soft, flat, and hollow in the way that only grief can be. Julian leaned back in his chair, pretending to nod in approval, but inside, something shifted. He should have felt triumphant. Instead, he felt unseen. He shook her hand. It was ice. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Now about that wedding, it was too perfect. The venue gleamed like a set design, cameras flashed, guests murmured about the beautiful bride with no past and the groom with no heart. Julian stood at the altar in a hand-stitched tuxedo, watching. Celine glided toward him, her expression unreadable behind sheer lace. There were no friends on her side, just a chair left empty at the front row, her request. He didn't ask who it was for. When they repeated their vows, her voice didn't shake. Julian's did, just a little. Only he noticed. Only she seemed to care. That night, after the party, the photos, the congratulatory lies, he opened the door to their penthouse suite and watched her walk in first. No hesitation. She placed her clutch on the marble counter, removed her earrings, and stared out the window at the city like she was waiting for it to speak back. "You have the guest room," Julian said, breaking the silence with something practical. Celine turned to him and smiled, just once, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you," she replied, walking down the hall. The door closed behind her with a soft click. Julian poured himself a drink and stood there for a long time. The view had never looked more artificial. Something about her lingered. Not perfume, not presence. Something older. He slept uneasily that night in a bed too soft, beside a wall too silent. And he dreamed, not of Celine, but of a woman screaming. Behind glass. The next morning felt like waking up in someone else's life. Julian opened his eyes to filtered sunlight spilling across the edge of the bed, painting sharp lines across the hardwood. The suite was quiet, too quiet for someone who had just gotten married the day before. He found Celine already dressed, sitting in the kitchen nook with a cup of black coffee, legs tucked beneath her like she belonged there. No makeup, no jewelry. Just her, staring at the steam rising from her cup like it held answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. "Morning," he offered, reaching for his tie from the back of a chair. She looked up slowly, then nodded once. Morning. That was it. They ate in silence. Toast, eggs, an orange sliced with mathematical precision. Selena didn't ask about his schedule. didn't offer to accompany him. She simply watched him leave, her eyes following him like a shadow that never touched the ground. The tabloids exploded, of course. Crane's bride, angel or ice queen? Marriage of convenience or secret romance? Who is Selina Varelli? Julian ignored the headlines and focused on his calendar meetings, the 1,000 fires that came with running Crane International. But Celine was always there, graceful, reserved, eerily composed at every public appearance. She never made a mistake, never stumbled in heels, never asked for help, yet she never smiled unless someone was watching. And even then, it was the kind of smile that came with a cost. Julian began noticing things, small things. She always stepped around mirrors, never directly in front of them. At charity galas, she'd stiffen slightly whenever classical music played in a certain key. And every night, she lit a small candle in her room before bed and blew it out exactly 3 minutes later. He told himself it didn't matter, that their lives were parallel lines, temporarily converging for the sake of business. But even in a contract marriage, there are moments no one can plan for, like the night they attended a museum gala, and Celine walked into the sculpture wing and suddenly stopped. Her fingers clenched the clutch in her hand until her knuckles paled. Julian turned to say something, but her face had gone white. The statue before her was a marble woman draped in stone cloth reaching upward, her face carved in anguish, her feet caught in vines. A plaque read, "Echo Remembered." Celine stared, motionless, as if she'd walked into a nightmare she'd tried to forget. Julian touched her elbow gently. "Celine." She flinched, not dramatically, but just enough for him to feel it, like her body had expected something else entirely. "I'm fine," she whispered. "It just looks familiar." That night in the limo, she didn't speak, and when they entered the penthouse, she stood in the middle of the living room and said, "Do you ever feel like you've done something unforgivable and just forgot?" Julian blinked. "What?" Celine gave a faint smile. "Never mind." Then she walked to her room and closed the door, leaving Julian holding an answer to a question he never meant to ask. The suite felt colder after that. In the days that followed, he kept seeing her in peripheral moments, reflected in windows, standing on balconies, folding laundry with reverent precision. And each time, it felt like she was performing something for an audience no one else could see. But it was their wedding night that returned to him most vividly, not because of romance or passion. There had been none. But because of the way she had looked at him when he offered her the guest room, like someone seeing a stranger in the body of a loved one long buried. And for the first time in his meticulously structured life, Julian Crane found himself obsessed with a question he couldn't bury beneath business plans and market forecasts. Who exactly had he married? And why did she look at him like she already knew how the story ended? The third night of their marriage was supposed to be another quiet evening, each of them drifting through separate rooms like ghosts, bound by formality and silence. Instead, it changed everything. Julian came home late, collar loosened, fingers aching from a day of closed-door negotiations. The penthouse was dim, lit only by a single wall sconce and the faint flicker of city lights beyond the glass walls. Celine's door was ajar. That alone was unusual. She always closed it firmly, like a line drawn between them. He was halfway down the hallway when he heard it, a stifled breath, jagged and trembling. Julian paused, listened. Then came the sound of something glass shattering inside. He didn't think, just moved. He pushed open the door and found Celine on the floor beside her vanity, her breath shallow, hands shaking as shards of a perfume. Bottle bled amber liquid onto the floor. Her eyes were wide, locked on something that wasn't there, body frozen like prey cornered by memory. The scent hit him next. Jasmine and something richer, orris root, heavy, old, familiar. Julian's. Her chest tightened, his thoughts scrambling towards something he couldn't reach. "Celine," he said, stepping toward her. She didn't move. "Celine, it's me, Julian." Her eyes snapped to his, but they didn't soften. If anything, they sharpened. "You don't remember," she whispered. What are you talking about?" he asked, kneeling carefully beside her. She tried to rise, stumbled, and he caught her by the arms. Her skin was ice again, her pupils huge. She blinked at him as if seeing a memory layered over his face. "I thought maybe part of you would," she said, her voice fraying. Julian steadied her, holding her gaze. "You're having a panic attack." "No," she said flatly. "I'm remembering." Then she turned and vomited into the bathroom sink. He held her hair without thinking, feeling the tremors rattle through her bones. After she rinsed her mouth and leaned against the cold porcelain, she said, "That scent, it was hers." "Whose?" he asked, trying not to raise his voice. She looked at him then, eyes glassy and ancient. "Your first fiancé." Julian went cold. "There was no first fiancé," he said carefully. "Not officially. There were a few relationships. Nothing serious." Celine shook her head slowly. "You don't remember her name?" He hesitated. That hesitation said more than any. "Answer?" "Her name was Leora," Selina whispered, "and she died." Julian stood frozen, his breath shallow. "Why would you—" "She wore that perfume," Selina interrupted. "You bought it for her. You bought it for her. On your last trip together. Paris, Rue Saint-Honoré. It's not even sold anymore." His vision narrowed slightly. A headache curled at the base of his skull. "That's not possible," he muttered. Celine turned away from the sink and looked directly at him. "Then how would I know?" They stared at each other, two strangers bound by paper and haunted by something they hadn't yet named. That night, Celine didn't return to her room. She curled on the living room couch beneath a throw blanket, eyes wide open. Julian watched from the hallway for a long moment, then walked back to his bedroom and poured 2 fingers of scotch. He didn't sleep. Instead, he sat on the edge of his bed, clutching an old box from the back of his closet, one he hadn't opened in years. Inside were photos, tickets, letters, memories he'd locked away like someone trying to erase guilt by hiding its bones. At the bottom, beneath a faded envelope, was a receipt. Paris, Rue Saint-Honoré, 1 bottle of Ombre de Lune, jasmine and orris. He stared at it until the city lights began to dim. When he closed the box, his hands were trembling, and all he could hear was her voice. "I thought maybe part of you would remember." The next morning, Julian didn't go to work. He sent his assistant a curt message citing illness, something he hadn't done in nearly a decade. Then he stood by the penthouse window, untouched coffee growing cold in his hand, watching the morning crawl across the skyline. Celine hadn't moved from the couch. She was still wrapped in the same grey throw, eyes open but unfocused, like she'd been staring at the same place on the ceiling all night. When she finally sat up, their eyes met across the room. Julian expected her to look embarrassed or withdrawn, maybe even apologetic for the night before. Instead, she looked calm. He stepped closer, cautiously. "You knew her?" Celine rubbed her fingers over the hem of the blanket. "Not exactly." "Then how?" he asked, sitting across from her. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared at the skyline behind him. "Do you believe in echoes?" He blinked. "Like sound." She shook her head. "Like lives. Energy. The things we leave behind when we leave too soon. Some people leave echoes that cling. Sometimes they choose someone to carry them." Julian didn't respond. Not because he didn't understand, because part of him did, and that was the problem. Selina stood, smoothing down her dress, and turned away. "It doesn't matter. You weren't supposed to remember her. That was part of the deal." Julian rose. "What deal?" Celine exhaled sharply, almost a laugh. "The one you didn't know you made." That was the last thing she said before locking herself in her room. Hours passed. Julian paced the apartment, the silence between them unbearable now. He kept thinking of the receipt, of the scent, of Leora. God. He hadn't said her name out loud in years. It had been an accident, a fire. She had been visiting her sister's art studio. Faulty wiring, they said. Julian had been on a plane when it happened. Landed to a dozen missed calls. The guilt never left, but over time it blurred, became something manageable, something boxed. Now it was leaking out. He texted Celine that evening. Dinner. Rooftop. Just us. She didn't reply. But at 7:05, she stepped into the elevator. With him, dressed in a simple navy dress, hair in a loose braid, eyes unreadable as always. The rooftop was quiet, private. He'd had it cleared. Just one table, one bottle of wine, and the wind curling around them like an invisible thread. They sat in silence for the first few minutes. Then Celine spoke. "Did you love her?" Julian looked up. "Leora." She nodded. He hesitated, then said, "I think I was learning to." Celine took a sip of wine. "She loved you, enough to stay even when she knew it would cost her." Julian blinked. "What does that mean?" Celine didn't answer directly. "Do you believe in memory loss, not from trauma, from choice?" Julian frowned. "No one chooses to forget." She looked at him, and for the first time her voice cracked. "You did." Julian stared. "Celine, who are you?" She smiled, faint and sad. "You still don't see it." "See what?" Celine leaned forward, hands folded. "You and I, this wasn't random. You didn't find me by accident. You pulled me back." Julian stood. "Celine, stop. Just please, tell me what's going on." She rose too, her voice sharper now. "You loved her, but you ran. When the grief came, you shut it out, locked it behind logic and ambition and cold walls. And when she tried to reach you, Julian flinched. She stayed too long," Celine whispered. "And it broke her, broke something bigger than just her." He backed away. "You're talking like I'm not her," she said quickly. "But she's still here, in me, around us. Echoes." "Julian, I told you, some people leave too loud." He couldn't breathe. Celine stepped closer, placing her palm against his chest. "She's not angry, just unfinished." Julian closed his eyes, and in that moment, he remembered something he shouldn't have. A voice whispering through smoke. "Don't forget me, even if it hurts." He gasped, stumbling back like the wind had punched him. Celine caught him. "Now," she said softly, "you're beginning to see." Julian didn't sleep that night. He lay awake in the dark, one arm across his forehead, the other clutching the corner of a pillow like it might anchor him to the present. But the present felt fluid now, distorted. His memories had always been precise, boxed, catalogued. But since Celine walked into his life, time had begun to fold in strange, uneven ways. He remembered Leora's voice, not just the pitch or timbre, but the way it would tremble when she laughed, the way she'd whisper against his collarbone when she was afraid. And he remembered that day, the fire, like a photograph that had been burned at the edges. But now there were pieces he couldn't place, moments that hadn't been there before, like a cafe he couldn't name, a silver bracelet with a single amber stone, a note written in handwriting that didn't match Leora's, but said, "I'm still with you, just in pieces." By morning, he was unraveling. Celine met him in the kitchen like nothing had happened. She was dressed in grey again, hair up in a twist, sipping tea like a houseguest who'd overstayed their welcome. "I'm going to ask you something," Julian said. She didn't look up. "Okay." "Are you haunting me?" That made her smile, genuinely this time. "Not exactly." He pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "Then what is this?" Celine placed her cup down gently. "It's a second chance, not the kind you think you want, the kind you've already asked for." Julian frowned. I never asked for this." "Yes," she said, tilting her head. "You did. Not out loud, not with words, but with grief, regret, desperation. Do you know what grief becomes when it festers? A doorway. And you opened one." He shook his head. "I'm not, Celine. I'm not crazy." "No," she said, "but you are haunted." Julian stood and paced the kitchen. "So what are you then, some medium, a reincarnation, what?" She watched him carefully. "I'm not the answer. I'm just the one who showed up when the question got too loud." That stopped him. "You could have chosen anyone," he said. "Why me?" Celine gave a faint laugh. "Because the part of you that remembers her, really remembers, was still calling out, even under all that concrete and steel." Julian turned away, gripping the counter. Outside, the sky had turned pale with a storm. He hadn't even noticed. "You said I ran," he muttered. "When she died," Celine nodded. He turned back, eyes sharp. "Then why the hell did she want me to remember?" Celine stood, stepping forward, her voice quiet now. "Because she never wanted to be a scar. She wanted to be a story." Those words knocked something loose in him. Julian had spent his life building walls, not just around himself, but inside himself. Rooms locked behind success, feelings buried beneath spreadsheets, but now the walls were cracking and behind them were whispers. He sat back down, suddenly exhausted. "What happens if I remember everything?" Celine's face softened. "Then you finally get to choose whether you'll carry her memory or be buried by it." He stared at her, uncertain, and then, quietly, "Will it hurt?" She nodded. "Yes, but not forever." That night, Julian pulled the old box from his closet again. This time, he didn't stop at the top layer. He sifted through old ticket, stubs, Polaroids with fading corners, notes scribbled on napkins, lipstick-stained receipts. And at the very bottom, taped to the back of a photo, was a single pressed flower, a dark blue delphinium. He held it gently, remembering the hike in Vermont. Leora had picked it, called it Melancholy in Bloom, and tucked it behind his ear. "I want you to keep it," she'd said, "so even when I'm not there, part of me still is." And now here it was, pressed, preserved, waiting. Julian cried that night, not the kind of tears that came with anger or frustration, but the deep, silent sobs of someone finally mourning what they'd never allowed themselves to grieve. In the hallway, unseen, Selina leaned against the wall, listening. She smiled through her own tears, because the story was beginning to open again. And Julian, for the first time in years, was finally listening. The air between them changed after that night. Julian still didn't know who or what Celine truly was, but he stopped questioning her presence. He'd stopped assuming she was here by accident. There was a rhythm forming now, strange and subtle, like two musicians tuning to the same key after weeks of dissonance. They spoke more, not about business, not about contracts, but about the in-between things, dreams, memories, fragments of thoughts they hadn't shared with anyone else. It was awkward at first. Julian had spent so long living behind boardroom poise and executive detachment that small talk about childhood fears and favorite rain smells felt foreign, even dangerous. But Celine had a way of disarming him, never by pushing, just by being quiet long enough that the silence itself invited truth. He learned. She couldn't sleep if the windows were closed. She learned he couldn't fall asleep unless he heard distant traffic. One night, she told him about a recurring dream, walking into a burning room to retrieve a single photograph that always turned to ash the moment she touched it. Julian didn't tell her, but he'd had the same dream. Not recently, years ago. Right after Leora, when he woke the next morning and saw Celine in the kitchen again, barefoot, humming under her breath, something caught in his throat. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was the weightless feeling of standing on the edge of something that could become it. He watched her pour tea into a ceramic cup and said, You don't remind me of her. Celine glanced at him. I know. But sometimes it's like she's near when you are. She nodded. That's because I listen. He sat down slowly. Listen to what? To the parts of you that still whisper her name when you're alone. Julian looked away, suddenly, ashamed. Celine smiled softly. You don't have to hide it anymore. That afternoon, he cancelled a meeting he'd been preparing for all week. Instead, he took Celine to the edge of the city, to an art gallery tucked between a wine bar and a piano shop. The exhibit was titled Lost Voices, dozens of canvases painted by people in mourning. Most of the works were abstract, color splashes, violent brushstrokes, empty space. But one painting stopped them both. It was a woman's silhouette standing inside what looked like a hallway of mirrors, only her reflection didn't follow. It stood still, reaching out through the glass, eyes wide and filled with something like sorrow, or maybe love. Celine's breath hitched. Julian turned to her. Do you know it? She didn't answer. But later, as they walked back to the car, she said, that hallway, it felt familiar. The memory returned to Julian like a whisper in fog. A studio, paint fumes, Leora laughing, saying she wanted to trap time in glass. He'd stood in a doorway just like the one in the painting. But he hadn't stepped in. He'd gotten a call. Something about a contract in Singapore. He left. The fire happened that same night. He stopped walking. Celine noticed and looked back. You remembered. I left her alone, Julian said quietly. That night. If I hadn't, you can't rewrite it, she said, but you can carry it better. He looked at her. How? By honoring her. Not just her death, but her life. Julian swallowed hard. I don't know how. You're learning. In the following days, Julian changed. Not dramatically, not in ways that outsiders might notice, but Celine did. He stopped checking his phone every 2 minutes. He lingered over breakfast. He asked questions and listened to the answers, even when they made him uncomfortable. And every now and then, he'd catch her looking at him with something close to pride, or maybe relief. One evening, they sat together in the living room. No music, no distractions, just twilight. Celine curled her knees up under her, sipping tea. Julian watched her, then finally said, Why did you agree to this? The contract marriage. She tilted her head, because it was the only way to get close enough. To me, she nodded once. But how did you know I'd even choose you? Celine gave a faint smile. I didn't. Then why take the risk? Because someone had to bring her story home. Julian's heart pounded. What happens when it is home? Celine's eyes glimmered. Then maybe I won't have to stay. The room fell quiet, and for the first time Julian realized something he hadn't let himself consider before. He didn't want her to leave, not just because of what she represented, but because of who she was. Celine, mysterious, steady, unfolding like a forgotten song he hadn't known he missed. And if she vanished the moment he remembered everything, he wasn't sure he'd survive the silence. It rained the next morning, the kind of rain that softened the edges of everything, buildings, traffic, even time. Julian stood at the window, watching droplets slide down the glass, like they were tracing memories he hadn't let himself feel in years. Behind him, the apartment was silent. Celine hadn't come out of her room. He knocked once. No answer. Twice. Still nothing. Then, from behind the door, I'm not feeling well. Her voice was faint, and not in the usual calculated way she used when avoiding questions. There was a hollowness to it, like something had gone out of tune. Julian hesitated. Do you want me to bring you anything? A pause, then, no, just let me rest. He backed away, uneasy. Celine had been his enigma from the start. Closed, precise, deliberate. But this was different. This wasn't mystery. This was absence. And for the first time since their arrangement began, he felt afraid of what that might mean. The day dragged. Meetings blurred. Conversations didn't stick. His mind kept drifting back to her voice behind the door. Flat, colorless, like something inside her had been pulled too tight and finally snapped. That evening, he left a plate of food outside. Her door, she didn't touch it. By midnight, he couldn't take it anymore. He sat outside her room, back against the door, speaking softly. "You know, I used to think grief was something you got over, like a wound that scabbed and then disappeared." The silence on the other side of the door was crushing. "But it's not, it's more like a room, one you carry inside you. Most days, the door stays shut, but sometimes, without warning, it opens. Still nothing. I think your door's open right now. And I just wanted to say, you don't have to sit there alone." He stayed there until he fell asleep. When he woke, the hallway light was still on, and the plate of food was gone. The next few days passed in a kind of limbo. Selene came out of her room, but she was quieter than before. She moved like she was walking through water, slower, heavier, as though something unseen was dragging behind her. Julian tried not to push, but one night after dinner he asked, "Where do you go when you disappear like that?" She didn't answer right away. Then, finally, "Nowhere. That's the problem. There's no place to go." Julian's voice was gentle. "Then why do you pull away?" She looked at him, tired. "Because remembering hurts, and I was never meant to carry this long?" Julian frowned. "Carry what?" "Her echo," she whispered. That night, he found her in the studio room. The same room where the box had been hidden. The same room Leora had painted in. Selene was sitting on the floor, hands wrapped around her knees, staring at the blank canvas propped against the wall. He sat beside her without speaking. After a long stretch of silence, she asked, "Do you want to know the truth?" Julian didn't move. "Yes, I'm not her, but she's in me, not like a ghost, more like a ripple, a residual thread woven through my soul. Sometimes I see what she saw, feel what she felt." She turned to him, eyes wet. "And sometimes I don't know where she ends, and I begin." Julian reached for her hand, held it gently. "I don't care," he said. "Who you are, what you are, you're here now. That's what matters." Selene blinked, startled. "Even if I'm a reminder," Julian nodded. "Especially then." Something shifted in her expression. Like the last light before sunrise, breaking over a long night, she leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. And for the first time, he didn't think about what any of this meant. He just let it be. They sat like that for a long time. Two people wrapped in silence, in memory, in something that felt like the beginning of peace. Until Selene whispered, "I think she's getting ready." Julian stiffened. To do what? To let go. And then, after a pause that felt like a held breath, "She's just waiting to know that you will still remember her when she's gone." Julian closed his eyes, heart thudding. He didn't speak, because he already knew the answer. The dreams returned that week. Not the fragmented nightmares Julian had once chalked up to stress and guilt, but vivid, immersive visions that gripped his chest and refused to let go. He saw Leora as she had been on the day of the fire, wearing that paint-stained hoodie, strands of hair tucked behind her ears, her face bright and untamed as she stood in the studio doorway, smiling at him through smoke. But there was no panic. In the dream, she didn't scream or cry. She simply looked at him and whispered, "It's okay. Just keep going." He always woke gasping, hands clutching the sheets, the echo of her voice hanging in the air like mist. Selene never asked, but she knew. She knew because she began leaving small comforts in the kitchen in the morning. Warm tea already steeped, notes that said things like, "You made it through the night," or "You remembered again. Thank you." Julian found himself clinging to those notes more than he wanted to admit. He also found himself watching her more, the curve of her wrist as she stirred her drink, the way she tilted her head slightly when she listened. She was different from Leora, every atom, every habit, and yet there was something in her that spoke the same language. He told himself it was projection. But late one night, when he passed by her room and heard her humming a melody Leora used to paint to, he stopped lying to himself. She wasn't Leora, but Leora wasn't gone either. Julian sat across from Celine at dinner the next evening. There was something trembling in the space between them, like both of them knew the silence had reached its edge. "I'm scared," he said. Celine looked up, surprised. "I'm scared that if I fully remember her, if I really let her in again, I'll lose you." She placed her fork down carefully. "You won't lose me." "But you said when she lets go, you might not stay." Celine reached across the table, her hand folding over his. "That was before." "Before what?" She gave a small smile. "Before you started choosing the present, not just chasing the past." Julian's throat tightened. "I didn't mean to," he whispered. "I know." He squeezed her hand. "But I don't want to lose you, Celine. Not now, not after everything." Her expression changed, softer now, more vulnerable. "There's still something you haven't remembered," she said. Julian blinked. "What do you mean?" "It's not just her death that haunts you. It's what you never said, what you kept locked away even from yourself." A weight settled on his chest. He knew what she meant. The last fight, the cruel words, the distance he created because he didn't know how to face the fear of losing her while she was still alive. "I told her she was a distraction," he said, voice cracking. Celine didn't flinch. "She wanted to move in together. I said no. I said I had too much going on, that she didn't understand pressure, that she wasn't serious enough." He rubbed his eyes. "I left. I went to a hotel that night. She called me 3 times. I didn't pick up." Celine waited, eyes steady. "I told myself I was punishing her, but really, I just didn't want to hear her hurt." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of grief, of release, of the truth finally coming to the surface after years submerged in guilt. Celine leaned forward. "You don't need to punish yourself anymore." Julian's hands were shaking. "But I did this. I abandoned her when she needed me. And then she died alone." "No," Celine said firmly. "She died loving you. She died hoping you'd find your way back to the part of you that could love again." He looked up, stunned by the certainty in her voice. "She left this thread behind for a reason," Celine whispered. "And I followed it here." Julian stood slowly, moved around the table. Celine rose too. He placed his hands on either side of her face, gently. "She's part of you," he said. "And now, so are you." Their lips met, slow, unsure, but real. It wasn't a kiss of replacement. It wasn't about filling the void. It was a kiss of acknowledgement, of presence, of a story that was shifting, one thread unraveling while another began to weave. When they pulled apart, Celine looked into his eyes and said, "You're almost there." Julian's breath hitched. "What happens when I get there?" She touched his chest lightly. "You'll see what was hidden in the fire." That night, as they lay in bed together for the first time, not in lust, but in closeness, in memory, Julian dreamed again, only this time he didn't wake gasping. He woke crying, but they were different tears, cleansing ones, because this time Leora wasn't in pain. She was painting. And in the dream, she turned to him and smiled, not with sorrow, but with peace, and said, "You didn't fail me. You just took the long way back." The fire had always been a blur, flames in his periphery, sirens distorting through the air. "Smoke," crawling up his throat until memory folded in on itself. Julian never asked for the details, not from the investigators, not from the neighbors, not from himself. But now, they came back, slow and hauntingly precise. It started with Celine's touch that morning, just a palm pressed gently over his heart as he lay beside her, breathing steady, but tense. "It's time," she whispered, though he wasn't sure whether he heard it aloud or only in his mind. And suddenly, the memories came, not like a flash flood, but like rain, gently pulling color from ash. Julian was in the car when the fire started. Not across town, not at a meeting, just around the corner. He had been parked outside the studio, hand on the phone, watching the call button glow. She'd tried to call him, yes, but what he'd buried deep down, the piece of truth that cut the worst, was that he saw the fire begin. He sat in the car, paralyzed. Not because he didn't care, but because he was afraid of running in and being too late, afraid of failing, afraid of the very thing that still haunted him, being the man who loved deeply but acted too slowly. The guilt wasn't just survivor's guilt, it was cowardice, and he'd never told anyone, not even himself. Julian shot up in bed, drenched in sweat. Celine sat at the edge, calm, as if she'd been waiting for this moment. "I was right there," he rasped. "I saw it. I could have—" "You couldn't have," she said softly, touching his hand. "You were already burning." Julian shook his head violently. No, I stayed. I watched." "You froze," she corrected. "And that's not the same." "But I could have saved her." Celine looked at him, not with pity, but with reverence. "You loved her. That was her salvation." He crumbled, chest heaving, eyes wet. "She died alone," he whispered. Celine leaned in. "No, Julian, she died, knowing you loved her. She died knowing your heart was still with her, even when your body wasn't." He couldn't hold it anymore. The years of deflection, of performance, of keeping the pain behind glass. He let it all break. Celine wrapped her arms around him, said nothing. She didn't try to fix it. She just let him fall, finally, into the arms of someone who could hold what he was too ashamed to face. Later that day, Julian drove them to what remained of the studio. It had long since been demolished. The land fenced off, overgrown with grass and silence. No plaque, no trace, just earth and memory. He stood in the middle of the lot, hands in his pockets, wind curling around him like a ghost that no longer meant harm. Celine stayed behind him, not intruding, letting the space speak for itself. Julian crouched down, brushed the soil with his fingertips. "It was right here," he murmured. "The doorway. She stood right here." He turned to Celine, eyes glazed. "I told her she was a distraction." Celine stepped forward, gently knelt beside him. "And yet, you remember everything about her, even now." He nodded. "That's not distraction," she said. "That's devotion." He lowered his head, shoulders shaking. "I wanted to marry her. I just didn't know how to love and lead at the same time. And now?" He looked at her. "Now I'm learning," he said. That night they returned home. Julian went straight to the closet, pulled out the old box, the one with Leora's sketches and journals and half-finished canvases. Celine didn't follow. She sat quietly in the living room while he unpacked each piece, soft, reverent, like unfolding a prayer. Among the journals he found a letter, unsealed, yellowed, addressed to Jay. He stared at it for a long time before opening it. The letter was dated 2 days before the fire. In it, Leora wrote, "If you're reading this, I probably got dramatic, and left this for you to find when we're old and grey and tired of fighting. But just in case something happens, I need you to know, I never needed you to be perfect. I just needed you to choose us when it mattered. I love you even when you're silent, even when you're scared, especially then. Julian read it 3 times, then again. Then he pressed it to his chest and closed his eyes. Celine entered the room and saw him holding it. She knew, he said. Yes, Celine replied, and she forgave me. She always did. He looked up, voice shaking. Then why couldn't I? Celine stepped forward, lifted his chin, because guilt feels like a way to hold on, but it's not. It's a weight, and she didn't leave it for you. Julian's lip trembled. What? Did she leave? Celine smiled. Me. The words sank in like sunlight through frost. He stood, moved toward her, kissed her forehead. I don't want to forget her. You never will, Celine whispered. But now, you can remember without breaking. They stood in the quiet for a long time, one man, one woman, and the ghost of a love that hadn't vanished, but transformed. A softness settled into the weeks that followed. Not peace, exactly, but a kind of earned stillness. The kind that only arrives after a storm has taken everything and left you barefoot, blinking in the light. Julian was different now. The staff noticed it first. He smiled more, listened better. Meetings no longer. Ran like sharpened drills, but moved in rhythms that left room to breathe. People spoke more freely. Even the office plants, it seemed, stood a little taller. But it wasn't just work. It was Celine. She moved through his space like she had always belonged there. No longer walking like a visitor, no longer watching him with one foot still in the shadows. She wore his hoodie one morning, absent-mindedly, and Julian felt his throat catch. It was the same one Leora had once painted in. He hadn't touched it in years, yet there Celine was, making tea, sleeves too long for her arms, looking like something, both sacred and ordinary. He couldn't look away. You okay? She asked, glancing over her shoulder. He nodded, voice tight. Yeah, just grateful. Celine smiled, but there was something else behind it. A hesitation, like a thought too heavy to say out loud. That evening, as they watched an old film on the couch, Julian turned to her. You're quiet today. She hesitated. I've been thinking about... She shifted slightly, curling, her legs beneath her. About what happens now. He muted the TV. Celine glanced down at her hands. This was supposed to be temporary, the marriage, the arrangement. Julian stayed silent, and yet, she looked at him now, really looked. Everything feels real. It is real, he said. Her voice dropped. Even if I didn't. Come here the way most people do. Julian's brow furrowed. Celine, none of this has been normal. But that doesn't make it less true. She bit her lip. Do you still see her when you look at me? He didn't answer right away. I see you, he said, but I carry her, that doesn't stop. Celine nodded slowly. That's what I was afraid of. Julian leaned forward. Why? Because I'm starting to want things, with you, things that belong only to us. Her voice trembled slightly. But what if there's no room left? Julian's chest ached. He reached for her hand. There's room, he said, because love isn't a house with limited space. It's a road that keeps going, and I want to keep walking with you. Celine looked like she might cry. Instead, she leaned into him. He wrapped his arms around her, and they sat that way for a long time. Two people pressing into something real, terrifying, and quietly beautiful. Later, Julian brought out a small black box. Not the kind that echoed boardroom deals or secret clauses, but the kind that held hope. I had this before we signed the contract, he said. Celine's eyes widened as he opened it. Inside, a delicate ring, not flashy, not loud. A single stone, warm as amber, set in a band that curved like a question, Mark waiting for an answer. I don't know where this is going, Julian said. I just know I want it to keep going with you. No contracts, no secrets, just choice. Celine stared at it, breath shallow. I can't promise I'll stay. The same, she whispered. I might change. This, whatever thread brought me here, it might pull again. I know, he said. But you're here now, and I want to choose you every day that you are. A tear slid down her cheek. She laughed softly. You're not very good at temporary, are you? Not when it feels like home. Celine reached for the box, lifted the ring, slid it on. It fit perfectly. She met his eyes and said, then let's see where the road goes. That night they danced in the kitchen, barefoot, swaying to no music. The past didn't vanish, the pain didn't dissolve, but it made room for laughter, room for kisses between cooking pans, room for beginnings that didn't erase the endings, but honored them. Julian caught himself watching her from across the room a few days later. She was standing near the window, sketchbook in hand, lost in thought. He didn't think of Leora in that moment. He thought of now, and for the first time in years, now was enough. The first time Julian saw the portrait, he stopped breathing. Celine had left it on the easel in the guest room, a room that was no longer a guest space at all, but hers. It wasn't locked or hidden, just waiting, like everything between them had been. He found it by accident, or maybe not. The house had been quiet that afternoon, sunlight creeping along the floors like it had secrets to share. Celine had gone, out for groceries. Julian had wandered, restless, fingers trailing across bookshelves and chair arms until he ended up at her studio door. And there it was. The painting. It wasn't Leora. Not exactly. It was a woman with fire in her hair and shadows in her eyes. Her hands reached out, not in despair, but in offering. Around her, the canvas swirled in smoky golds and deep blues, like she stood between two worlds. At her feet, embers. In her chest, a keyhole. And behind her, barely visible in the paint's layering, a faint silhouette of another woman, one that looked hauntingly like the sketches Leora used to draw of herself. Julian stood frozen. It wasn't just art, it was memory. Rewritten, reclaimed. When Celine returned, she found him there, still staring. I didn't mean for you to see it yet, she said softly. He didn't turn. What is it? Her voice trembled. It's who I am, and who she was, and the space in between. He turned to her now, eyes wide. You painted the fire. She nodded. Not the flames. The truth. He moved closer. The keyhole. She reached out and placed her palm over his chest. Where you kept the guilt. He swallowed hard. And the second woman in the back. I used to dream about her, Celine said, before I even knew your name. Julian felt the floor tilt beneath him. What are you saying? She hesitated. I think I came into this world carrying something that wasn't mine, a grief that had no name, and when I met you, it fit. Julian's heart pounded. You think you were sent here, he whispered. Not sent. Drawn. By what was unfinished. By what needed to be healed. He stepped closer. Are you her? Celine's eyes didn't flinch. No, but I carry her flame, the same way you do. Silence stretched between them, not empty, not awkward, just sacred. Julian reached out and touched the edge of the canvas. It feels alive, he murmured. Celine smiled. That's because you are now. He turned to her. Will you finish it? I wasn't planning to. Why not? Because I don't know how it ends. Julian took her hand. Maybe we finish it together. And so they did. Over days and weeks, they returned to the studio, Celine guiding the brush, Julian mixing. Colors, sometimes in silence, sometimes in laughter. The painting evolved, not to erase the past, but to weave it into something new. The second woman grew clearer. Not a ghost now, but a presence, watching, blessing, letting go. One evening, as they added the final strokes, Julian whispered, Do you think she'd be proud? Celine paused, brush in midair. I think she already is, he nodded, throat tight. I hope she knows I never stopped loving her. Selene rested her head on his shoulder. She does. And now she knows you learned how to love again. Julian looked down at her, kissed her hair. This time, he said, I'm not running. She smiled. This time, neither am I. That night they hung the painting in the hallway just outside the bedroom. It caught the light differently every hour. Sometimes it looked like sunrise, sometimes dusk, and sometimes, when Julian passed, it in the quiet, he swore he heard the faint sound of humming, the tune Leora used to paint to, not haunting, not eerie, just present, like a memory that had stopped screaming and started singing. The first call came on a Monday. Julian had just stepped out of the shower when his phone buzzed with a number he didn't recognize. He almost let it go to voicemail, but something in his chest, some quiet instinct, said otherwise. He answered. Julian Roth? A man's voice asked, clipped, official. Yes, this is Detective Marlowe, Seattle Police. I need to ask you a few questions about a woman named Celine Vale. Julian's breath caught, his hand tightened on the phone. What is this regarding? There's no cause for alarm, but we've had inquiries. Her background file has certain omissions. Julian walked to the bedroom window, towel still around his waist. You're telling me you're looking into my wife? There was a pause. Are you aware that Celine Vale does not appear to have a birth certificate registered in any state? No school records prior to 2020, no driver's license until last year. Her identity history starts 4 years ago, then goes dark. Julian's voice dropped. What are you saying? We're saying that either she's changed her name and wiped her past clean, or she didn't exist before 2020. The line went quiet. Julian's thoughts raced. He hung up without saying goodbye. When Celine came home that evening, he didn't say anything at first. Just watched her. Watched how she moved around the kitchen, how she smiled when she took her shoes off, how she tucked her hair behind her ear and hummed an old melody without thinking. Finally, he asked, "What's your real name?" She froze. The knife she was using to cut strawberries hovered in mid-air. Then she turned slowly. What did you say? Detective. Marlowe called me. Her face shifted, not into fear, not quite, but into something ancient, tired. They're looking into you, Julian said, and they found nothing. Celine set the knife down. You don't have a childhood, he said quietly. You don't have a paper trail. Celine didn't deny it. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table and folded her hands. I knew this would come. I just didn't think it would be today. Julian sat across from her, pulse pounding. Tell me the truth. She looked him dead in the eye. I don't know where I came from. He blinked. What? She exhaled. I woke up 4 years ago in a hospital in Utah. No ID, no memory, just a name on a bracelet, Celine Vale. No one came for me, no family, no friends. I wasn't in the missing persons database, nothing. Julian stared, mind reeling. They said I must have had trauma, she continued, that my amnesia was psychological, but no one could explain how I got there, or why there was no record of me. Julian leaned forward, voice low. Why didn't you tell me? Because I didn't know how. Because you were grieving someone with roots, and I didn't even have a past. He swallowed. And the dreams of the fire, of her. I think those weren't dreams, Celine whispered. I think they were memories, but not mine. He went pale. You think you're her? No, Celine said, firmer now. I think I'm me, but I think something of her came with me, a piece, a thread. Julian's heart pounded. Like reincarnation? I don't know. Maybe something more subtle. Not rebirth, just return. The air between them crackled. Julian stood, paced. You felt it too, Celine said gently. You knew it the night we met. You said I felt familiar. He turned to her. A dozen, thoughts crashing inside his head. You were drawn to me, and I to you, not because of who we are, but because of what's been left behind. Julian closed his eyes. This sounds insane. She nodded. I know. But it also makes sense. Celine's voice dropped. I think whatever brought me here wanted to give you another chance. Not with her, but with yourself. Julian sat slowly. His chest felt like it might cave in. What do we do now? He asked. Celine reached across the table, took his hand. We live together, in truth. And the detective? She shrugged. There's nothing to find. I've stopped running. If they come, I'll tell them everything. Julian looked at her for a long time. Then quietly he said, I believe you. Celine's eyes filled. Even after all this? He nodded. Especially after this. They didn't eat that night. Didn't speak much either. They just lay on the floor in the living room, side by side, staring at the ceiling, their fingers interlaced. Two people stitched together by something older than logic, older than time. Not love in the ordinary sense, but something deeper. Recognition. Winter came early. The first snow fell in the quiet hours of morning, frosting the garden in white, softening the world like a whispered apology. Julian woke to the silence and found Celine standing at the window, barefoot, wrapped in one of his sweaters. She didn't speak right away. Neither did he. They just stood there together, watching the snowflakes drift like suspended time. It had been 2 weeks since the call. The detective hadn't followed up. No visits, no pressure, just silence. Julian wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or more suspicious, but Celine didn't seem worried. She moved through the days with a kind of peace, as if something inside her had finally stopped clenching. As if now that her truth had been spoken aloud, she could finally exist. That morning, as they drank coffee and watched the sky blur white, Celine turned to him. There's something I want to do. Julian glanced over. What's that? She hesitated. Go back to the hospital, the one in Utah, where I woke up. Julian's brow furrowed. You think it'll help? I don't know, she said, but I need to see where it began. Maybe it's time to stop waiting for answers to come to me. He reached out, wrapped her hand in his. Then I'm coming with you. She smiled, eyes glassy. I hoped you'd say that. They flew out. 3 days later. The town was small, colder than Seattle, and steeped in that dry, high-altitude quiet that made every footstep sound sharper. The hospital still stood. Same yellowing walls, same pine trees creaking outside, a receptionist who looked half asleep, until Celine walked in and froze. The woman blinked. My God. Celine stepped forward. Do you remember me? I think so, the woman said slowly. You're the girl from room 214. No ID, no visitors, the one who disappeared. Julian and Celine exchanged a glance. Wait, he said. She disappeared? The receptionist nodded. You were just gone one day. No discharge papers, no transfer. It was like you vanished. Celine's mouth opened, but no sound came. I thought maybe you walked out, the woman continued. We reported it, of course, but there was nothing to go on. You weren't in any system, not even facial recognition. Celine swayed slightly. Julian steadied her. Do you know who brought her in? He asked. The woman frowned. I wasn't on duty that night, but hold on. She disappeared down a hallway. Minutes later, she returned with a thin folder. We don't have much, just this. Inside, a single page of intake notes. Unconscious female. Approx. 24. No ID. Found at the edge of Canyon Road, wrapped in a blanket. Dropped off by an anonymous caller. Celine stared at the paper. The address, Canyon Road, made something in her tighten. She closed her eyes. And suddenly she could see it. A cliffside, a cold wind, stars above her burning like eyes, and someone whispering, Forgive. and begin again. Her eyes snapped open. Julian was watching her. "You remembered something." She nodded. "I think I was left there, like placed." Julian's voice was low. "By who?" She shook her head. "I don't know, but I don't think they meant to harm me." They left the hospital in silence. That evening they drove to Canyon Road. The mountains stood like old gods watching. Snow crunched underfoot as Celine stepped out of the car. She walked to the edge and stood. Julian joined her. "This is it?" She nodded. "This is where I began." He glanced at her. "Or where something ended." She smiled faintly. "Maybe both." A hush fell over them. Then Celine took something from her coat pocket, a small piece of charcoal, the kind she sketched with. She knelt beside a nearby tree and began to draw on the bark. Careful, focused, a circle, a flame, a woman with open hands. When she stood, Julian saw it clearly. It was the woman from her painting, but this time her face was unmistakable. It was Celine. "I'm not a ghost," she said quietly. "I'm not a second chance. I'm not a soul borrowed from someone else." Julian touched her cheek. "Then who are you?" She looked at him and smiled. "I'm what's left when the fire doesn't win." They didn't speak the whole drive back. They didn't need to. Something had shifted, not just in her, but in him. The letter arrived in spring. No return address. Just his name, written in looping ink across a pale grey envelope that felt oddly heavy in Julian's hand. Celine found it in the mailbox and brought it inside, tilting her head at the handwriting. "Do you recognize it?" Julian shook his head. "No." He opened it at the kitchen table while Celine brewed tea, the scent of chamomile and bergamot curling into the air like the past reaching forward. Inside, a single sheet, handwritten, the ink slightly smudged. He read it aloud, slowly. "Julian, you don't know me, but I knew her, Leora. I was the one who dropped Celine at the hospital. I couldn't stay. I wasn't allowed to. But I watched. I waited. I knew when the time was right, you'd find her. And when you did, I knew she'd wake up. Not just Celine, but the part of her you lost. The part that never burned. You don't have to understand this. Only accept that some threads are stronger than death. Stronger than fire. What you build now is yours. But don't forget the light that led you here. A friend." Julian stared at the words, fingers tightening around the page. Celine's voice was barely above a whisper. "Someone knew. Someone sent me." He nodded slowly. "And they were watching." It wasn't paranoia that followed, just awe. A creeping sense that the world had always been larger than they allowed it to be. That perhaps grief had never been a closed door, but a corridor. And someone, or something, had been lighting lanterns the whole time. Julian folded the letter and slid it back into the envelope. "It feels like an ending." Celine shook her head. "No, a blessing." The next day, he bought a small glass frame and placed the letter inside. He hung it in the hallway next to the painting. It didn't feel like surveillance anymore. It felt like acknowledgement. From that moment on, things softened. The business Julian once lived and died by no longer ruled his hours. He handed more to his board, stepped back from the spotlight, and found peace in the spaces he'd once tried to fill with achievement. He and Celine traveled to Greece, where olive trees whispered in warm breezes. To Kyoto in the fall, where temples stood hushed beneath golden leaves, and once back to the lake where he had scattered Leora's ashes. This time, not to mourn, but to sit and breathe and remember without hurting. Celine stood by the water's edge that day, her hands open at her sides. Julian watched her from the dock. She turned, smiled. "I used to dream of this lake, long before I saw it." He walked toward her. "How?" "I'd hear the water, feel the cold of the wood under. My feet, it always ended the same way. How? I'd look up and someone would be waiting. Julian swallowed. Was it me? She looked into his eyes. No, she said softly. It was someone who loved you, but couldn't stay. Julian's breath caught. He looked out across the water, and this time, when the silence came, it wasn't empty. It was full of memory, full of grace. They left the lake hand in hand. That night, back home, Julian lit a candle and placed it by the window. A quiet tradition they'd started. Not to summon, not to mourn, just to mark the night, to say, we are still here. The flame flickered gently. Selene came up behind him, wrapped her arms around his waist, and rested her head on his back. He placed his hands over hers, and for the first time since that terrible day in the hills, Julian felt no weight in his chest, only warmth, only breath, only presence. Julian dreamed again, but this time it wasn't fire. It was rain, cool and gentle, like soft fingers tracing his skin. He stood in the middle of a quiet street under a flickering lamplight, alone, but not lonely. Something about the air felt known, as if he'd been here before in another life. And then he heard it, a voice, not spoken aloud, but curled into the rhythm of the rainfall. A whisper, soft and warm. You did not fail her. You carried her light. He turned, and in the hazy distance he saw two figures, one familiar, a woman with her back to him, long hair swept over one shoulder, standing beneath an arch of ivy and light. The other, smaller. A child, maybe 3 or 4 years old, clutching, her hand laughing as the rain bounced off her cheeks. The woman looked over her shoulder, and in that brief second, Julian saw two things at once: Selene's face and Leora's smile. He woke with tears on his cheeks and the sound of laughter still in his ears. Selene stirred beside him, eyes still closed, but her fingers sought his under the covers, holding tight, as if she knew where he had been. That morning something changed, not abruptly, not with drama, but subtly, like the first bud of spring cracking open in the soil. Selene's voice was soft at breakfast. "I'm late." Julian looked up from his mug. "What do you mean?" She gave a shy smile. "My cycle. I checked twice." He set the mug down slowly. "Are you saying, 'I think I'm pregnant'?" The words hung in the air like music, tentative, holy. Julian didn't speak. He just stood, walked to her, and fell to his knees, wrapping his arms around her middle as if protecting something sacred. Selene cradled his head, fingers tangled in his hair, whispering, "It's real. This is all real." He pressed his ear against her belly, even though he knew it was too soon to hear anything. Still, in his heart, he swore he could feel it, not just life beginning, but a full circle closed. That evening, Julian returned to his studio. He hadn't painted in months. He opened the windows, let the breeze in, and stood before the blank canvas. For once, the fear was gone. He didn't worry if it would be good. He didn't try to recreate the past. He just began to paint. Selene, in golden light. Not as a mystery, not as a ghost, but as herself, smiling, real, alive. And beside her, a child with wide eyes and a crown of firefly sparkles in their hair. It took him 3 days. When he was done, he showed it to her. Selene stared for a long time, then touched the tiny hand in the painting. "Do you think it's her?" she asked softly. "I think it's us," Julian said. "All the versions of us that made it here." They hung the painting in the front hallway, across from the letter in glass. Visitors often paused, touched their chest without meaning to, then said something like, "This feels like home." It was, not perfect, not without questions, but home. Julian no longer feared forgetting Leora, because he hadn't. He'd carried her with him, not as ashes, not as ache, but as fuel. He and Selene made it, through the next months with quiet strength. Doctor visits, night cravings, dreams of names whispered into pillows. And then, on the first warm morning of summer, in the stillness before dawn, Celine went into labor. It was long, it was painful, it was sacred, and when the baby arrived, wide-eyed, calm, already watching the world, Julian knew her. He didn't understand how, he just knew. They named her Elia, and when she cried for the first time, it wasn't a wail. It was a note, clear, sure, steady. Julian held her close, felt her tiny heart flutter against his. He kissed Celine's forehead, trembling, overcome. "I see her in you," Celine whispered. "Both of them, the woman you lost and the man you became after." Julian nodded, tears falling freely now. "And I see you, all of you." The past no longer haunted him. It sang, soft lullabies, familiar glances, tiny hands around his finger, coffee on cold mornings, candlelight on windowsills. Not because everything was perfect, but because it was real. And finally he understood. Some stories don't end in flames. Some begin again in the quiet. There are some stories that don't rush to their endings. They unfold like breath, like dawn, like the soft turning of a page. And sometimes we don't even realize we've reached the last chapter until we look up and see that the light has changed. This was a story about grief, yes, but also about return, about how the people we lose are never truly gone. They echo in new voices, new touches, new chances we never thought we'd deserve again. Julian didn't get Leora back, but he didn't need to, because the love he once thought he'd buried became the very soil in which something new took root. A story not of replacement, but of renewal. Not of forgetting, but of carrying forward what mattered most. Celine, with her quiet strength and her impossible past, didn't just enter his life. She reminded him that healing isn't erasure. It's integration. It's breathing through the ache. It's learning how to live beside the memory and then miraculously building something beyond it. If you've ever lost someone, if you've ever stood at the edge of a burned life and wondered what's left, maybe this is your reminder. There is always something left. And maybe, just maybe, that something is enough to begin again. Thank you for staying with me through the very end of this journey. I hope it gave you what you didn't even know you needed. We'll meet again.